So let's talk about how we combine these transformations and apply more than one at a time, because oftentimes we're not going to see our transformations isolated as we just went through in those examples. So if we have multiple transformations, we are going to follow PEMDAS order when we're applying them. So that means we're going to start with anything inside parentheses. And we're going to start with addition or subtraction inside parentheses, which is our horizontal shift. Then we would move on to a horizontal reflection inside parentheses, so that would come from having a negative in front of that x, but still being inside the parentheses. Notice here that I don't have a horizontal stretch or compression listed. That would go between steps 1 and 2, but like I mentioned before, we don't spend a lot of time doing that in this class, so we're not going to focus on that in these notes. So then after, if you did have a horizontal reflection, you would move on to your vertical stretches and compressions. So your PEMDAS step there would be multiplication or division outside the parentheses. And that can be a vertical stretch or compression. That could also be a vertical reflection, because those both are multipliers in front of that set of parentheses. I made a note over there, these steps are interchangeable because they do come from that same PEMDAS step of multiplication or division. So you can apply those in either order. If you want to reflect your graph first and then stretch or compress it, you can do that. Or you can stretch and compress it first and then finish up by reflecting your points. That order is up to you. But we do have a vertical reflection there since it is outside parentheses, which means we are flipping it over the x-axis. And then your final step from your PEMDAS order there is addition, subtraction, outside parentheses, which does result in step 5 here of your vertical shift, just moving your entire graph either up or down. So if you just remember PEMDAS, that's the exact order that you're going to apply multiple transformations in when you sketch its graph. So let's look at a few examples then. So first example here, we're going to list our transformations in that correct PEMDAS order, and then we're just going to sketch the graph. Just like we did before, we're not going to worry about plotting exact points. We're just going to focus on moving that vertex or that point of inflection or some kind of intercept, moving it around there. So looking at this first graph, y equals our equation, y equals -3 times x minus 1 squared minus 2. Thinking about PEMDAS, we're going to start inside our parentheses. So the first transformation we have here inside parentheses is this -1. We know adding and subtracting results in a shift. This is inside, so it is going to be a horizontal shift, either left or right. And when it's inside parentheses, we do the opposite of what we see. So instead of a -1, we're going to think about a +1. So our first step here is to go to the right 1 unit. Okay, then our next step, if we're thinking through PEMDAS, there's nothing happening with our exponent. That exponent of 2 just tells us what kind of function we have. So there's nothing we need to do from the exponent. So then we can move to this coefficient in front. And remember, we mentioned before, the negative sign and the number itself tell us two separate things. So first, let's focus on the number. It is a number greater than 1. 3 is greater than 1. So our second step here, because that number is greater than 1, means we're going to have a vertical stretch. Now remember, a vertical stretch means that our graph is going to look thinner. So I'm just going to make a note of that so that when we sketch the graph later, we make sure to bring the sides of that graph in. And then we can look at the negative sign there. Again, it's outside parentheses, so it's going to be a vertical change, and that negative tells us it's going to be a reflection. So we have a vertical reflection, and when we reflect something vertically, that does flip it over the x-axis. And then our final transformation here in PEMDAS, we finish up with addition or subtraction outside parentheses, so our last step here is that -2 at the end. We're going back to a shift, but it is a vertical shift since we are outside parentheses. And when it's outside, we do exactly what we see. So a -2 there at the end tells us that we're going to move our entire graph down 2. Now that we have our transformations, we're ready to sketch our graph. So right now, while we're just sketching and we're not worrying about plotting specific points across the entire graph, we can just focus on moving that vertex with our shifts, so right 1, down 2, and then when we sketch the rest of the graph, that's when we'll apply that vertical stretch and vertical reflection. So our vertex currently is at 0, 0 here. We'll move it right 1 and down 2. So now it's down here at 1, negative 2. And then to sketch the rest of the graph, we need to make sure we draw a thinner parabola so that we apply that vertical stretch. And then we also need to reflect it. So instead of being an upward facing parabola, it's going to flip over and it's going to be an upside down U. So it's going to look something like this, where that's definitely much thinner. We can see a visual change between the parent function we were given and our new graph, and then it is facing upside down, so we are seeing that reflection happen. All right, next example, we're going to follow the exact same steps here. So listing out our transformations in PEMDAS order, and then applying those by just sketching a graph below. So PEMDAS, we're going to start inside parentheses there. We do have a +3. We know when we have anything inside parentheses, we do the opposite of what we see. So instead of moving +3, we're going to move -3 to the left. Okay, then we can move to multiplication or division, which is this coefficient in front of parentheses. That is a number less than 1, between 0 and 1. So that is going to be a vertical compression. And a vertical compression gives us a wider graph because it's squishing everything together. So we are going to get a wider graph here, just kind of pulling those sides out to the sides. And then finally, we'll finish up with addition or subtraction, so that +4 at the end. We're going to do exactly what we see, so we're going to move our graph up 4. We are just sketching a graph here, so we're going to focus on this inflection point here in the middle. We're going to shift it left 3 and up 4, and then we'll just sketch the graph around it, applying that vertical compression. So moving left 3 and up 4, we get our new inflection point there. And then we want a wider graph, so I'm going to make sure, I'm going to kind of even over-exaggerate it so I can definitely see a difference between the parent function and what this one should look like. So I'm going to make sure I see a wider curve happening around that inflection point. And we can see right here through the middle, that's definitely wider than what the parent function we were given. All right, final example. We have y equals negative square root of -x plus 3. So listing out our transformations first, starting inside those parentheses, which actually our square root is acting like our parentheses now. So inside that square root, we have this negative sign. So that's going to be our first transformation here. We know a negative tells us we have a reflection. That negative is inside the square root or inside parentheses, so that is going to be a horizontal reflection. And when we're reflecting horizontally, we're going over the y-axis. Okay, then moving on to multiplication and division outside the parentheses. Now we're looking at that negative sign outside. So again, we have another reflection, but this time it's outside, so it's going to be a vertical reflection. And if we're reflecting vertically, now we're going over the x-axis. So we have two reflections flipping over both axes below. And then lastly, again, we'll finish up with addition or subtraction. So our third step here, when it's outside, we do exactly what we see, so that +3 tells us we're going to move our graph up 3. All right, so we're going to focus on this endpoint here at 0, 0. That's what we're going to move up 3, and then as we sketch the graph around that point, we'll apply both reflections. And we can actually do those reflections first. I want to kind of walk through those a little bit. So first, if we reflect this over the y-axis, We're just reflecting over, right? So now it's going to be pointing into the second quadrant here. Just going to sketch that in. And then if we reflect that over the x-axis, now it's going to be upside down. So same kind of curve, just upside down now. And then finally, we'll move all of those points up 3. It'll still stay upside down, pointing off to the left. So it'll look something like that. So the pink graph there would be your final graph. All right, that is the end of our notes over transformations. So take time. If you need to go back and watch any piece of this video, feel free to do that to make sure you understand your different transformations as thoroughly as you can. When you're ready, then you can move on to the assignment.